In this video, we'll talk about pawn structure. Pawn structure helps us know what plans to take, when to seek an endgame, and when to realize that a position has some advantages to our side. Strangely enough, this important information is many times ignored by many amateurs. So, do yourself a favor and let us learn about basics of pawn structures. Let us start with the backward pawns. A backward pawn is a pawn that has fallen behind its brother pawns and can't be guarded by them or safely move side by side with them. In this position, black's d6 pawn is a backward pawn and it becomes an instant target for white. White just played knight from e3 to f5 here, threatening to capture that backward pawn. Protecting the pawn with queen c7 does not work, since white will still capture it anyway with knight takes d6, bishop takes d6, and rook takes d6, leaves white a pawn up. If rook moves to d8, it does not work either because there is knight takes e7, knight takes e7, rook takes d6, and white is still a pawn up. If black tries to block it with knight d4, apparently that does not work because of the knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, and we still have the +1 in pawn. Advancing the pawn to d5 is also not a good idea. In other words, that backward pawn on d6 is a weakness for black. If you see backward pawn or pawns in your opponent's position, you should make it a target. And if you yourself have some backward pawns on your own, do your best to get rid of it or improve your position. Listen, I'm going to give you some tips in handling backward pawns. If you see a backward pawn or pawns, you need to consider the following before making a plan. First, is it standing in an open file? If that backward pawn is standing in an open file, that could become a target for attack. If not, then the pawn will not probably be a significant weakness. In this position, black's b7 pawn is a backward pawn, but it does not stand in an open file, so it's not a huge weakness in itself. Black's d6 here is also backward, and the fact that it is standing in an open file, here in d file, it makes it a potential target since white's rook can pile up on the poor thing there and later on it could be knocked off the board. Very similar to the previous example. Another thing to consider with backward pawns is that, is it heavily defended? A well-defended backward pawn, even one sitting in an open file, can often shrug off many kinds of attacks. In this position, d6 is a backward pawn and is well defended, so it's not in danger. Even if white goes to f5 here with knight, that threat would remain a threat quite longer and black does not care. Occupying the d5 square here with knight d5, for example, knight d5, bishop takes d5, pawn takes d5, would make that close the file of the d6 pawn, but at least occupy the d5's weak square. So, if you're dealing with a well-defended pawn, the best thing to do is to be patient for a time and see if that becomes a potential target later on. Or capitalize on the weak square in front of it by making it as an outpost for your pieces. The last thing to consider when it comes to backward pawns is that, can it advance successfully, thereby getting rid of itself as the backward label? Let us go back to the story of the d6 pawn. In this position, backward pawn here in d6 can move to d5 safely. Therefore, this gives black allows black to eliminate a significant weakness from his side. Woof! We've just started. And we just talked about backward pawns. Let's move over to the next in the list. We have the doubled pawns. Doubled pawns, these congested traffic pawns are many times seen as, disadvantaged by many players. Though despised by most players, the doubled pawn is not all bad, and often it can be an actual advantage. First, a doubled pawn gives its owner an extra open file for his rooks. Second, if the pawns are centralized, they allow for coverage of critical squares. That would not be possible if the pawns were undoubled and healthy. Let us take a look at this position. White's doubled e-pawn here, or e-pawns, give him control over d5 and f5 squares, and also d4 and f4 squares. The open file here is another perk that this structure offers. This rook on f1 is in fact putting some pressure at black's kingside, given that there's already an active bishop here in this diagonal. So that would be a big plus for white. Naturally, double pawns can also turn out to be inflexible and, in the worst case scenario, simply weak. In general, the lead doubled pawn turns out to be a target. Let's take a look at this position. Here, we have doubled pawns on c3 and c4 for white. And it becomes a target for black as the c4 pawn is in fact weak. c4 pawn is vulnerable to knight a5. And if white replies with knight g3, protecting the pawn, bishop a6 takes that pawn away. So therefore, this pawn is really, really weak and can be captured by the opponent very easily. Next up, isolated pawn. An isolated pawn is created when no one or no other friendly pawn is on the adjacent file. This lonely guy, can't be touched or defended by any of its brothers, and as a result, it becomes vulnerable to attack by enemy pieces. Most players feel that an isolated pawn is always a weakness. However, nothing can be further from the truth. Do you know that an isolated pawn can also give advantage to one's position? Let us consider this one. An isolated pawn can be dangerous if it becomes an unstoppable passer. In this position, this d6 pawn here is an isolated pawn and gains superiority due to the fact and due to the strong support that it has from its friends, from white's pieces. The isolated pawn managed to safely and strongly advance further while being protected by his comrades. An isolated pawn can also be a plus if it's centrally placed, which means that it may guard important central squares. As in this position, this isolated d4 pawn is key and gives control for white over c5 and e5 square. An isolated pawn may also be an effective battering ram that will slam into the enemy's superior structure. Take a look at this. In this position, black plays a4. Now, to get rid of this isolated battering ram, and after making a pawn trade, for example, if white takes the pawn with b takes a4, this rook causes an open file for this rook in the a file, and this isolated pawn in the white side of the board could be a target for white, since rooks could pile up here and end up taking that as a target. The idea of for example a4, and then for example white moves something else. This pawn here, if protected by white, could become the same story as before. This pawn will become an isolated pawn in white's turn, and in favor for black, that will become a heavy target for attack. So it turns white's healthy majority into a weak isolated pawn in this position. So sometimes To get rid of your own isolated pawn, you need to make a way to get rid of it and cause damage into opponent's position, and turns some disadvantages from your side to an advantage. Next, pass pawns. Most players take it for granted that pass pawns are advantages to own. Though often true, especially in the endgame, pass pawns can also be disadvantage. Let us take a look at this next position. To decide when a pass pawn is useless or useful, you must ask these two questions. First, is there a quiet or strongly protected pass pawn when both sides have played elsewhere that has nothing to do with that passer? In other words, if you have a pass pawn, all right, and there's an action somewhere else, okay, even one that isn't doing anything here, a pass pawn that does not do anything in one side, can prove useful as an endgame insurance policy, so to speak. In this position, there is an ongoing tension on the d file. If all the rooks will be traded, then we are going to the endgame, right? Now, but white's pass pawn here gives black a scare as the endgame soon approaches. Therefore, this pass pawn will be saved as best weapon later on. Can the pass pawn be firmly blockaded? If it can, then the pawn may end up acting as a traitor and give the opponent some access to a key square, and that would be a traitor pawn. Okay, now, in this position, the blockading black knight is ideally placed here to block that pass pawn for white. All right, it would not be able to remain on its comfortable home position if that d5 pawn does not exist, right? Also note how white's passed pawn blocks the d file. This d5 pawn is not very friendly to its comrades, because that could, if that pawn is not there, this knight could be essentially, outposts in this d5 and would be very, very strong there. Or perhaps uh, this piling up of two rooks here would open a file, or this bishop could, is not heavily congested here in this diagonal. So therefore, uh, this d5 pawn for white is somewhat traitor, somewhat not doing a very good job here, and this pass pawn seems to be not very useful at all. All right. So if a pass pawn can't be blockaded, the pawn can run down the board and cause panic in the enemy's position. That would be another story if in this next position. In this position, white pass pawn has further advanced and looks like a serious threat torturing black's position. This is the opposite of the previous example, wherein this pawn has not really been blockaded totally and safely moved forward and protected by his friend. So therefore, it creates problem to black. Next up, pawn islands. When you say pawn islands, these are pawns or group of pawns separated from other pawn groups. Now, in this position, we can see that white has 3 pawn islands here. We have the a4 and b2 pawns as one island. Number 2, d and e4 pawn is another island. And number 3, we have G and H pawns as another island. So 3 islands for white. For black, all of these pawns are connected and gives black a strong bond together as a pawn. Now, how do we evaluate this position? Well, in general, the side with fewer pawn islands is thought to have the superior pawn structure because each island may become individually vulnerable to attack. Going back to this position, we see that white's H pawn and G pawn are both potentially vulnerable to attack, while this is facing this open file here. And another thing is this E4 pawn for white is also in need of defense. White's queenside pawns may also, this one, might also come under fire at some later stage of the game. But at the moment, they are fixed by the enemy pawn on a5. Black's connected pawns here. We have, how many pawns do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are looking to be more secure than white's. And they're connected and much tighter. His only attackable unit is actually here in c7. And in the perspective of black, the move here with queen to g6 and rook a to g8 would be a very good move for black. Attacking points in two different islands will put him firmly in command, and that would be a very good thing to analyze in a position where number of pawn islands usually happen in a typical game.
Hey, check this video out to make sure that you get more important information to bring your chess to the next level.